Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Settling the Boom, The Sights and Subjects of Bakken Oil, edited by Mary E. Thomas and Bruce Braun, narrated by Suzie Althens. Preface. Settling the Boom, The Sights and Subjects of Bakken Oil is a collection of essays that examine efforts to contain the lively and disruptive petrocultures of an oil boom and its aftermath in a remote northwestern corner of North Dakota, and to expose their underlying settler colonial frameworks. Rather than simply charting a course through the boom-bust extraction cycle, our book analyzes what Mark Rifkin calls the privileged background epistemologies that establish a condition of possibility in settler colonialism's violent and ongoing extension in time and space. Our goal in assembling this edited book is to illustrate the work that goes into settlerist orderings of time and place as a practice of critique and disruption of the all-too-familiar logics and practices of settler colonialism and racialized heteropatriarchy in the oil fields of North Dakota. We ask, how does a frenetic boomtown and its region come to be ordered through familiar settler affective infrastructures, aesthetics, and narratives? How do the forces of the settler state, petrocapital, and heteropaternal urban messaging and planning in the Bakken work to congeal the boom within certain social and spatial forms, and not others? How do these orderings fold and refold time and space in their attempts to ensure that futures remain imagined through and tethered to settler colonialism and white patriarchies? We, and the other contributors to the book, answer these questions through analysis of the powerful settler colonial, cisgendered, heterosexual sentimentalities operating to calm the region's anxieties after what had been assumed to be a certain future built on fossil fuel extraction. Many of the themes across the chapters in Settling the Boom found their first iteration in a workshop hosted by us, Matt Coleman and Catherine Yusoff, in the summer of 2015. The Antipode Foundation sponsored this field-based gathering of 14 scholars through an International Workshop Award, and a reporting of the workshop's culminating conversation titled Grounding the Anthropocene, Sites, Subjects, Struggles in the Bakken Oil Fields can be found on Antipode Online. 5 of the contributors to this book, the two of us and Morgan Adamson, Thomas S. Davis, and Jessica Lehman, attended the workshop, and the author Kai Bosworth had a mention in the Antipode posting from Bruce. In the report of the Grounding of the Anthropocene workshop, several participants noted the ways that boomtown narratives inhabit a cruel optimism in which the promise of a better future seems forever out of reach, an expanding horizon of hopeful possibility, feeling a horrific present of dangerous work, exhaustion, transient lives, longing for the promise of the good life, and as participant Mario Blazer notes, treacherous land relations that overshadow other beliefs. He asks, what kinds of infrastructures, material semiotic assemblages of attachment and detachment to this place, and others, are there? What kinds of attachments and detachments do they foster? These questions, and the enduring prompt from Lauren Berlant's Cruel Optimism, remain at the heart of this volume. Indeed, Mario's questions are as relevant today as in 2015. Finalizing this project now, in 2022, offers a different perspective from that of 2015. Today we situate our arguments, not just around the boom's temporal unfolding and from the moment just after the commodity price fell in the autumn of 2014, but more important, we also attend to the boom's social-spatial reconciliations. While booms disrupt, displace, and replace, the socio-ecological forms that congeal in their wake require considerable aesthetic, narrative, and political work. Indeed, the very fabrication of the Bakken boom stories told and retold ensure in their familiar repetition an all-too-easy alignment of what happened and what is yet to come. Yet that rote telling and representation of settlement, we argue in the introduction, is not sturdy, inevitable, or final, or, even for that matter, accurate. Settling is processual, complex, provisional, contingent. The predominant versions of how calm returned to western North Dakota indicate the normative forces fueling those versions more than they reflect a reality of what happened. The very notions of settlement, of catching up after the chaos of the boom, and a calm return to normal, are not objective accounts of next stages in time, as all of the essays in this book demonstrate. Further, these notions of settlement assert an oil boom as an aberration, rather than assemblages and continuations of forces that propel, encourage, and precede or exceed it. Their precise resolutions over time in specific locations are impossible to predict from within the boom or even from generalized theories of petrocultures. In fact, the moment of resolution is an open one, without end in time-space. In this book, we resist the pull to provide a timeline of our own for Bakken geographies and geologies, which would merely resubmit an authoritative settler perspective through the back door as an academic account of what happened. As this project's editors, we understand our roles as white settler scholars in more modest terms, as ones that can work to lay bare the geographic and temporal propulsion of settler colonialism's linearities, its machinations of white supremacist heteropatriarchy, and its material hierarchies and violences, including those experienced by workers drawn to the region by the promises of economic security and personal redemption. Even as we refuse settlerist spatial and temporal accounts as fully representative of what happened in the Bakken, in this book, we elevate attention on how settler colonialism's entrenched commitments to futurity operate linear time as progress, particularly through heteronormative family formation and social reproduction, frontier spaces of masculine labor and mineral extraction, understood as economic and U.S. national expansion. As white settler scholars, we take our roles to be aptly focused on bringing background epistemologies to the foreground of Bakken petrocultures and geographies in order to understand and challenge colonial infrastructures of attachment. By parsing these formations, we show their ad hoc nature, how they provisionally hold together, yet also contain the contradictions, possibilities, and elements of other stories and truths. These forces and formations are specific to the sites and subjects of the Bakken. Attending to their qualities exposes how settlement works in Williston, North Dakota, and questions what and who gets removed or erased in service to the settler temporalities fabricated. We resolutely do not take it as our role, as white settlers, to represent indigenous interests or subjects, though about 1/4 of Bakken oil is produced on the lands of the 3 affiliated tribes of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara MHA Nation on the Fort Berthold Reservation. Our perspective refuses what Audra Simpson labels as settlerist good intentions, which would merely add alternative accounts to the boom to provide a supposedly more inclusive picture, which merely maintains a lie that settler states and societies can diversify and not have to fundamentally decolonize and revolutionize. These divergent temporalities can be seen in the controversial slogan used by supporters of oil development in the MHA Nation. The tribal chairman in 2011, Tex Hall, proclaimed sovereignty by the barrel as a direct challenge to the linear trajectory of settler time and its background assumption of the space-time of the nation-state, its institutions, and its interests. Although not uncontested within the community, oil development on MHA land from this perspective is not just about economic development achieved through royalties and production taxes, oil field jobs, and direct oil production controlled by a tribal corporation. It also points to, and potentially facilitates, an indigenous temporality that is different from settler time shaped by the land and the relationships and responsibilities it entails. While understood variously, these relationships and responsibilities open to diverse indigenous futures, even within the slow accretion of settler violence, the breaking of treaties, flooding of tribal lands to secure downstream white communities and their agricultural economies, displacement of whole communities to new sites, water governance, residential schools, the exposure of Native people to settler policing, and Native women and children in particular to settler violence, that has produced an affective world that diverges radically from white settler subjectivities and imaginaries. We do not attempt to describe or represent the complex and heterogeneous indigenous temporalities in the region or arbitrate different positions held by MHA members in relation to fossil fuel extraction. Our goal is not to fracture settler frameworks and temporalities in order to elevate Native sites and subjects. We have not been invited to undertake these tasks. The land and its futures are not ours, or that of any settlers. We do take as our task the practice of undermining settler white supremacist beliefs, especially as they work to reassert racialized heteropatriarchies as the legible formations of life and place in the region now and into the perpetual horizon of settler time. We do insist that there is nothing inevitable about settler colonial heteropatriarchies, despite their widespread iterations in Bakken boomtown stories and visualities. As Mark Rifkin writes, exploring what constitutes the background for marking and experiencing time then draws attention not only to the milieu, at whatever scale, that serves as the context for thinking and feeling time's unfolding, but also to the taken-for-granted process through which temporal dynamics are figured. What white settlers violently take for granted does not equate to what is or will be. We thus understand settler backgrounds as unresolved and unsettling questions without answers, and that we should not resolve by merely adjudicating other, better settler renditions. Yet politics and resistance do not begin and end with making settler colonialism visible. As Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang warn, doing so can merely be a gesture to ensure its future. Our work in this volume, especially in the introduction, is therefore to unsettle what settler colonial forces assume is resolved, to show that the disruptive boom has not settled down into a resolved future or into, as usual, accounts of oil's political economies. There are other inheritances besides settler colonial heteropatriarchies. The research that informs our work as editors was collaborative and spanned a number of years. Bruce has been a longer interlocutor with the region, with many years of passing through Williston. His witnessing the curious changes to the region over time led to this project in the first place. We visited the region together over the course of 3 summers, 2014 to 16, with a larger team, including Matt Coleman, Max Woodworth, and Catherine Yusoff, interviewing a range of oil field workers, city officials, local historians and curators, workforce trainers and job placement advisors, journalists, land and water protectors, and even a Lutheran pastor who explained how he led a community funeral to provide closure for his Williston congregation who had lost their settler, prairie idol, to widespread drilling and disruption. These interviews and our conversations profoundly shape the ideas in this book, as does the feedback received on earlier chapter drafts. We owe the origins of this idea-making to the larger research group. Thank you. We also send gratitude to all of our interviewees, especially Donald Kress of the Williston Planning Office, for his hospitality and patient explanations about a huge range of urban and regional issues and geographies. Artist Jessica Christie provided cover art for Settling the Boom from her collection Through the Window. We saw the collection when we visited the exhibition Bakken Boom, Artists Respond to the North Dakota Oil Rush in 2015 at the Plains Art Museum in Fargo. Jessica, originally from eastern North Dakota, lived in Minot, at the eastern edge of the Bakken at the beginning and at the height of the boom. Her installation in Fargo included 150 shadow boxes containing what she calls relics, or found objects, that were all assembled in a very small space. The installation visitor experienced the claustrophobia of the boom's imprint on everyday life, especially for women, through the box's contents and arrangement. The Plains Art Museum's exhibition was a steady source of inspiration as we conducted research and as we continue to teach about the boom. So we are delighted and honored to have Jessica Christie's art frame this collection. Thank you, Jess. We gratefully acknowledge our graduate advisee research assistants, especially Jessica Lehman and Mary Everest, who worked with Bruce, who also thanks the Grant in Aid of Research, Artistry, and Scholarship Program at the University of Minnesota for funding, and Krista Benson, Anthony Tenney, and Mary Byrne, who worked with Mary, who thanks the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexual Studies at The Ohio State University for funding. Our colleagues and friends, and reviewers, for their many comments and incisive feedback on drafts and presentations, and research funding from Humanities Without Walls, the University of Minnesota, and the Division of Arts and Humanities in the College of Arts and Sciences at The Ohio State University, which provided funding for Thomas S. Davis and Mary E. Thomas. Most important, we thank the chapter authors for their patience during the long pandemic years, which slowed completion, and editor Jason Wiedemann and the staff at the University of Minnesota Press for their steady and incisive stewardship. Introduction. Unsettling the Boom. Mary E. Thomas and Bruce Braun. Bakken booyah! Rockin' the Bakken! Bakken goes boom! These exuberant marketing slogans greeted us when we entered the Williston Economic Development Office in the summer of 2014. Though not evident at the time, North Dakota was just about to hit the end of an oil boom after several years of rapid growth. The region's population had increased dramatically as workers poured in to fuel the seemingly insatiable demand for labor. The local housing shortage was acute, with hundreds of people sleeping in their vehicles on the city's streets and in parking lots every night. Construction projects spread across the landscape, adding hotels, restaurants, single-family homes, schools, new roads, water and sewage lines, and apartment, retail, and office complexes at every turn. The price per barrel was high, the number of rigs drilling was high, wages were high, food and services prices were high, revenue was high, the mood was high. Only a few years removed from the Great Recession, national media was still fixated on the region's wild ride as it soared along with record-setting commodity prices. The executive director of the Economic Development Office showed us chart after chart that day, predicting the steady growth of oil production, jobs, and population until at least 2050. One chart he shared, made by the Western North Dakota Energy Project, predicted that Williston's regional population would hit between 100,000 and 120,000 by 2020, and slowly increase from there for at least another 2 decades, the ascending line at the right margin hinting at growth in perpetuity. As the director put it earlier that year in a public presentation, it is going to last for a very long time. It is 2021 as we finalize this introduction, and the city of Williston's population hovers around 29,000, with another 8,600 in the rest of Williams County. Adding neighboring McKenzie and Divide counties contributes another 17,000 to the population for the Williston region. Williston has a speculative bond rating lower than junk, and the Economic Development Office is not high anymore. Its current slogan, somewhat pleadingly, proclaims that the city is open for business. The Williston Community Guide tries to sell the city's appeal for young millennial families, its quality of life, ample employment opportunities, and wholesome recreational offerings. The guide invites the reader to settle in. The boomtown high has evaporated, replaced with empty hotel rooms, unfinished development projects, a new international airport that is largely unused, and crushing municipal debt. A past, produced pre-pandemic, in early 2020, Economy at a Glance document for the city quotes the current director's caution. I am sorry to say these numbers will continue to get worse before they get better. Commodity reliance can be cruel to towns like Williston, but optimism girds the assurance that better comes after worse. Like the right margin of perpetual growth, the messaging remains primed for the future's possibilities. This book considers specific boomtown stories, aesthetics, and relations in northwestern North Dakota in order to contend with settlement. We and the other chapter authors place keen attention on Bakken Boom While storytelling, textual and visual, precisely to examine how it engages with and enacts the lively and potentially disruptive petrocultures of the Bakken Boom, and, with varying degrees of success, attempt to contain this storytelling within normative affective infrastructures and understandings. Rather than evaluating the right margin through a correction of its predictive failures and a revised account of its data, we interrogate the temporality of that margin and what it insinuates about the temporal imaginings and affective attachments that run through North Dakota's oil cultures. We contend with settlement, in other words, by situating the oil play as an iterative process through its myriad attempts to order the sites and subjects of the Bakken. Central to this process are settler colonial temporalities and tenses, and the privileged settler background epistemologies that Mark Rifkin argues establish a condition of possibility in settler colonialism's violent and ongoing supremacy. As an iterative process, settling the Bakken Boom uses the power of settler colonial narratives and aesthetics to repeat beliefs about time as unfolding into a waiting future. The margin is therefore no ending of a process, but its perpetual extension, especially, as we will show throughout the book, through heteronormative patriarchies and fossil fuel extraction. The margin can merely gesture into that waiting future, however, because the accomplishment of any optimistic settled form is, as Lauren Berlant so astutely argued, fantasy. They write, fantasy is the means by which people hoard idealizing theories and tableaux about how they and the world add up to something. Berlant famously points to the cruel optimism of effect in the present as a relation that exists when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your flourishing. We take the right margin of perpetual growth to be an affective structure that attempts to translate the energies and flows of an oil play into an apparent, if spectral, order that will appear at some point in the future, supposedly. The waiting for boomtown settlement thus enacts a wide range of violence and land dispossession and justifies these through assurances that something better is coming, in time. Yet, settling the boom as a project is centrally motivated by our belief that we should work against the effective structures of settlerism and, importantly, also against an academic provision of post hoc, alternative political imaginaries in response to them. Each imagines a settled form, as if settlement is achieved and final, and that which we should reactively address in our scholarship, as if alternatives are not always in creative existence and tension all along, or as if alternatives are not themselves potentially more banal in their own attempts at transformation. After all, as Berlant suggests, most often nothing actually occurs that is all that different. In fact, the promise of something else, a break, like a boom or its bust, might even be the very route into further normative colonial settlement. Across this volume, the chapters pay special attention to the specificity of the Bakken as a site, as we situate the predominant affective structures seeking to settle the boom in the region. By delving into the geographies and aesthetics of the region's settler colonial formations and examining its site-specific iterations, our analyses seek to relay the ways that foreclosures and erasures in time and place actually operate not as effects that necessarily follow from resource extraction, but as enacted and provisional relations, temporalities, and materialities specific to this place at this time. As we wrote with collaborators in 2015, without keen attention to the site, the oil boom becomes so generalized that its specific spatial, geological, and temporal aspects go unexamined, and as a narrative form, the boom-bust cycle remains intact as a future-oriented threshold pointing to what comes next. The chapters in this book, in contrast, push against a temporal fetish of the Bakken's right margin through the author's grounding analyses of the place, its geology and land, and the reiterative settler geographies of its subjects. Central to our collective task is to expose the affective structures of settler time. Following Audra Simpson, we situate settler time and its place in the Bakken region as fiction. Simpson writes that settler time is the fiction of the presumed neutrality of time itself, demonstrating the dominance of the present by some over others, and the unequal power to define what matters, who matters, what pasts are alive, and when they die. Like the ever-expanding carbon capitalism and settler colonialism that the right margin fantasizes, settler time represents events and conditions in place as they may be rendered into a waiting future always already imagined as a settler future. In the Bakken, settler time establishes land not as relation, but as that which is perpetually extractable, objectified, and passive, waiting only for the right time for commodification and improvement. We argue that tense is a vital component of settlement, especially the future anterior, or future perfect, per Elizabeth Povinelli, 2011. This verb tense indicates something that is expected to happen before a specific time in the future. It will have. The concept of development, for instance, assumes an accomplished event that will have been completed in the future. It is the promise toward which the present labors and for which the labors of the present are justified and endured. As we and other authors explain, the future anterior fuels the cruel optimisms that pervade the petrocultures of North Dakota and help sustain its normative forms. Indeed, as we explore in the book's conclusion, nowhere is the play of tense more evident than in the promises attached to infrastructure, roads, pipelines, airports, housing, as that which will finally translate the volatility of an oil boom into a settled and settler future of prosperity and uninterrupted progress. As the spectral promises of infrastructure illustrate, boomtown narratives and aesthetics often fail to fully accomplish what they seek to represent, visualize, and form. We, and the other authors, argue that the boom is not yet, and will never be, settled. Settlement is never accomplished per se, for indeed, the sites and subjects of the Bakken boom are always open for contention, change, and protest, despite the tidy reconciliations and renderings that suggest a final version of what happened or that project a normative vision of what is to come. This is, at heart, why we titled the volume Settling the Boom, as a reminder of the open, contested, and contentious nature of settlement. Almost a decade after oil's price collapse halted most drilling in the heart of the Williston Basin, in late 2021, there are fewer than 24 rigs in the 6-county region. That settling continues, as does the need to unsettle the forceful narratives and visualities that propose to represent and respond to what happened. Settler aesthetics and settler time. What allowed for...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?